how to composite motion blur in Blender. So I already have my animation set up. I have my cube just going across. Might be able to move faster, but I'm just going to leave it as is for now. I have everything organized into collections, and I've already done some setup with my render settings. Now, I do want to make sure that my output location is in the location of my choice instead of just the temp folder. And I need to make sure I have the OpenEXR multi-layer file format so that it saves all of the data that I need saved. Now, depending on how much I want to be able to customize things, there are actually a couple of ways to get motion blur. One is actually directly in the rendering settings. You can turn on motion blur. There's some settings here that you can adjust, and that will probably give you a pretty high quality motion blur. It factors in things like the lighting in the scene, which is really great, but it's going to significantly increase your render time. And if you add the motion blur through the compositing step instead, it's going to be significantly faster rendering, though perhaps a little less accurate because it won't be factoring in lighting. All right, so we're going to be doing the second approach using motion blur through compositing instead of just the built-in. So in the view layers, there are 3 passes that I need enabled. I need the combined pass, I need the Z pass, and I need the vector pass. Now I do want to mention, if you have an object that you're blurring that has transparency, or if you just have a lot of transparency in your file in general, you might be better off with the mist pass as a replacement for the Z pass, but you can always experiment one way and change it later on if you want to. And I'm going to do this all in a single view layer. Now I do, in the output settings, want to make sure that I am just rendering a single, or actually I'm going to render a few frames to start with. Usually I like to do just a little bit of a test render, and I don't want to render out the full sequence just to save some time in case I realize I need to come back and make changes because I'm not satisfied with something. Now, because this is showing motion blur, I think it's helpful to show more than one frame, which is why I'm going to do 3 for my test. So I'm just going to render the animation. It's going to go through and render my 3 frames. All right, so that's finished. I'm just going to save my file and create a new general file. I can ignore everything that's in the scene and just head over to compositing. I'm going to check use nodes, and I'm going to delete the render layers just with an X. So the composite node determines what's actually in the output. I'm going to search for and add an image node. It was just Shift A to get into the add menu. Going to connect this over to composite, and then Shift A, I'm going to search for a viewer node so that I can see what's going on. This is also going to connect from image to image. Now I'm just going to open the sequence that I rendered. And opening those images. All right, so I'm going to be adding maybe an alpha over for now, and this is going to connect from combined to image, and then from image to each of the image slots for my output. I'm going to add a vector blur node, so I'm just Shift A to add, searching for vector. I want vector blur, and this is going to be connected from combined to the image slot and from image to the lower image, which lets me see the entire thing at the moment. And I'm going to connect from depth to the Z slot. If I had mist instead of Z, I would drag that to mist, so it can connect either one for the depth pass. And then vector is going to connect to speed. You can see the red cube is the only one that is moving, So right now it has a little bit of a blur. Now the samples is just going to be about the amount of detail. So I could put this low, I could put this higher. It's a matter of personal preference. And then blur is obviously the amount of blur that you're actually adding. So if you have a low number, very little blur. As the number gets higher, the amount of blur really increases here. And because I have multiple frames, I can see how that's looking across the frames that I have with that amount of blur. Now I can't play in real time because it has to do some processing, but I certainly can just scrub through and see how that level of blur would be looking. Sometimes we'll get a better result keeping the moving object completely separated out on its own layer and then correcting that. So let's see how that changes things. I'm just going to save this to start with. I like to use the same name, just with a C at the end of the name for compositing. And it's helpful to keep the compositing in its own file for a couple of reasons. One is that it actually cuts down a lot on processing. It actually lets you render more quickly. And then if you end up going back and making changes to the original file, you don't end up having the composite interfere with the original render or the reverse, depending on what you're trying to do. So just easier to keep things separated out. All right, so I'm going to go back to my original file so that I can go through the process of separating this out into multiple view layers so I have more control over the actual motion blur. Now, I've done a little bit of adjustments to the collections here. I've moved my cube that's actually animated and moving into its own collection. I've also created this new collection specifically for something called a shadow catcher. Now, because I'm going to be moving my cube onto its own layer, it's not going to be able to have shadows naturally. And so I want to sort of catch the shadows and keep track of where they would actually be on the ground plane. And the shadow catcher also will grab any reflections at the same time. So I made the shadow catcher just by duplicating the ground plane with Shift D, and then I moved it into its own collection. All right, so now going through the setup for the file itself. First of all, I'm going to just rename my original view layer, and I'm just going to call this background, and this view layer is only going to have things that are part of the background. So I'm going to leave my original collection with the camera and the light. I am going to keep the cubes, but only indirectly. So if I right click on the cube collection, I can go to View Layer and set indirect only. And so this is allowing me to keep the reflections of the cubes on my ground plane, which will be part of this collection. I'm going to uncheck the God rays because I don't need them at all. I'm going to uncheck the cube that's moving because that's going to be targeted separately. And I'm going to uncheck the shadow catcher. Now over in the view layers, I've already removed the Z and the vector pass. I'm leaving combined, and I've also checked the environment pass over here. So it's going to take the blue background and render it as its own pass. Now, so that separating out the environment works properly, I need to turn on transparency. So over in the render settings, I'm going to go under film, and I'm just going to check transparent. So with this particular view layer, it's going to render what we see right now with a transparent background, but also with the environment as its own pass. Next up, I'm just going to make a new view layer. This one is going to be for the background cubes. I'm just going to call this cubes. Now I'm going to keep the original camera available and light. I'm going to keep the cubes. I'm going to turn off the God rays because I don't need them. I'm going to turn off the moving, or actually, no, I'm going to keep the moving collection turned on, but just like I did with the other layer, I'm going to come over to View Layer, set indirect only, so that I'm getting the reflection of the cube on the other cubes behind. I don't believe I need the environment, and I don't need the shadow catcher. So that looks like it should be okay. If I wanted to, I could leave the environment, but do indirect only. I might get a little bit more reflection going on in this slightly glassy cube, so it might be better doing that, but kind of a matter of personal preference there. And the cube that is moving is indirect only, so that I'm getting the shadows and reflections across the other cubes. And as far as the passes go, all I need is combined. I shouldn't need anything else, unless I wanted to add an emission pass for doing bloom, but I'm just going to leave that off. New layer. This one I'm going to call animated because it is for my moving cube. I'm going to keep the original collection. I think I'm going to set the cubes to indirect only. God rays are completely off. The environment is completely off. The moving cube is on, and the shadow catcher is on. Now, because this is for the motion blur, I do need this animated layer to have Z and vector checked. And I'm also going to check shadow catcher because I actually have the shadow catcher enabled. Now there's one more thing I need to do. In the shadow catcher object itself, I need to come over to the object settings, and I've already actually checked shadow catcher, but that needs to be turned on. So this is going to be catching the shadows and the reflections from the cube based on everything else that's going on. And because I've duplicated the floor, it's using that material to help determine sort of the lighting that's impacting the cube itself. Because the floor is a little bit reflective, it's reflecting a little bit of light up at the cube. So that's just something to be aware of. The material on the shadow catcher really matters. But the shadow catcher itself is not going to be visible. It's just going to be showing the shadows and reflections across that particular surface. All right, so I'm just going to double check my view layers. I have my background with the environment. I have my cubes, and I have my animated view layer with the shadow catcher. So that's all looking good. I'm going to choose another frame to render. I think maybe I'm going to go and do frame 24. There we go, because it'll show the shadows pretty clearly. And just doing a single frame this time to make sure everything's correct before I render out the full sequence. So I'm just going to come over, render animation. We'll see because of the different view layers, it's going to render just each layer individually, and anything that is the background will just be completely transparent, which will actually speed at least that part up a little bit. All right, that's all set. I'm just going to save my file and head back to the compositing file. I'm going to come over to the folder, go to frame 24, which is the one that I've rendered the most recently. And we can see the motion blur effect is still working at the moment, but I'm going to need to come back and do some changes here so that I can actually work with my multiple view layers. So just to start, I'm going to duplicate the image node, so Shift D to duplicate, and Shift D to duplicate one last time. Now the upper image node I'm going to set to the background. The middle I'm going to change the layer to cubes, and I'm going to leave the last one to animated. Now the node setup is going to be pretty involved. I'm going to add another alpha over, so I can just Shift D to duplicate the one that I already have. This is going to connect from environment to the top image slot, and then from combined to the bottom image slot. I'm going to add a blending node called multiply, but it's actually, if I use Shift A, it's actually a mix color node set to multiply. And this one is going to connect from my top image socket to the image socket, so multiplied image up at the top. And so if we take a look at what's going on right now, it is just showing the background by itself. So I'm just going to disconnect that for a moment, switch that back over. And now I'm going to disconnect from combined from my cube over here from the upper image sockets. So it's just the vector blur at the bottom. And I'm just going to connect from image to image. So right now, all I have is my background and I have the blurred out cube. Now, next up, I'm going to work on connecting my other cubes into the background. So I'm going to need a few different things for this. And actually, I'm going to disconnect the vector blur for right now because there is going to be another alpha over in between. So I'm just going to duplicate this alpha over with Shift D. Image is going to connect to image, and vector blur is going to be on the bottom over here. And on the top, I'm going to have my combined coming over here. I'm just going to move everything off to the side. So that's giving me my background, my cubes, my moving cube, and the only thing that's missing are the shadows. You can see there's this additional shadow catcher pass over here, and I'm going to be connecting that to this empty multiply socket. So there are two things that I'm going to do as part of this. So first of all, I'm going to just connect the shadow catcher to this image socket, and we can see how it's behaving right now. So we can actually see the shadow that's being cast from the floor. You can see there's a little bit of reflection, which wasn't there before. So that is looking pretty good there. If I want to, I can go through and add some of the motion blur to the shadow, just like I did to the object itself. So if I'm doing that, I might grab the vector blur, Shift D to duplicate it, and just connecting it from the shadow catcher to multiply with the image sockets. And just like before, depth connects to Z, and vector connects to speed, and that starts to impact the shadow as well. So I can play around with how much I want that to blur or how much I don't. So I can keep working with and adjusting that as needed. And that is pretty much it as far as the compositing the different layers goes. So if I'm satisfied with the results, I'm just going to save with Command S. Then I can go back to the original file, correct the range that I actually want to animate, and just let the animation render. All right, the render is finished. I'm just going to close out, save my file, and head back over to compositing. At this stage, I just need to open my full image sequence in each of my image nodes. So I'm just going to the folder icon, A to select all of my frames, open image. And when I'm selecting a new range, it's going to go back to, in this case, the animated view layer. So I'm going to switch this one to background. So folder icon, A to select everything, open image, correct the view layer, folder icon, A to select everything, open image, and in this case it's already the correct view layer. So if you've done compositing before, you may know that real-time playback doesn't work because it has to do a little bit of calculating. But if you scrub through, you can see the movement. Now, keep in mind that most of the settings that are here are things that can be animated. Right, so something I can actually do is keyframe the amount of blur. So let's say from 1 to frame 8, the blur is all at 0. I'm just going to set the number here, hovering over the property, I to set a keyframe. And then maybe by frame 15, blur is fully on at 1.0, which was the setting I was using before. Need to hover over that and add a keyframe. And now the amount of blur is going to be gradually increasing. So it's going to come into the scene without any blur. Then the amount of blur gets turned up. And I can do this for any other properties that I want. But assuming everything is the way that I want it, I can just render out the animation. Though actually, if I am going to add keyframes, I should probably do it for both vector blurs. So frame 8, I might want to set this to 0, I to add a keyframe. Frame 15, back up to 1, I to add a keyframe. So now that's going to be consistent wherever I'm using the vector blur. All right, so at this point I'm ready to just render to video, and I can do it directly from my compositing file. I do highly recommend if you change the resolution in the original file to set this to exactly the same settings on this end. I always want to choose my own render location, and I do want to specify the video format, and in this case I'm also going to change the file, well, the encoding container. And I want to make sure also that the range that I'm rendering is the same number of images that I actually have. All right, and then I can just render animation. It's going to be incredibly quick because it is pretty much just stitching things together. There's very little processing involved. And it's only 30 frames, but that's already finished. If I come over and take a look on the desktop, I have the video, and it's always a good practice to play through the video to make sure it looks the way that you want it. All right, so that is the basics of working with blur, and also the basics of working with multiple view layers so you can target one or more of your objects individually.